Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Today, I will be talking about three subjects which I will relate to each other throughout this podcast. First, Indigism. Second, Bundism. And third, Gaza and the Palestinians in general. Let me begin with some basic definitions of those terms. What is Indigism? Indigism is a respect for indigenous people around the world, a respect for their rights. As I had mentioned before, one of the major characteristics that is shared by many, but not necessarily all, indigenous people is a love of the land, a loyalty to the land often viewed as the mother. They are the children of the land. The land is regarded many times as sacred. It is not a concept, sadly, I would say, that I can personally relate to, which means that I am not an indigenous person. Now, if you want to use the term indigenous in a very broad sense, we are all indigenous, meaning we all originate from somewhere, and I am no exception. But that doesn't mean that I am indigenous in the modern use of the term, because I have no special affinity for any particular part of the world. I have lived in numerous parts of the United States, born and raised in New York City, then lived in the South, the Midwest, and now in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Do I feel any special connection with any of those places? The answer to that question is no, I don't. When I left a place and moved to a new place, I very rarely even missed it. The one exception, I suppose, was when I left New York City. But in that case, I did not miss the land. What I missed were the bookstores, literally, because I would love going into Manhattan and trouncing around from one bookstore to another, back in the days before books were available on digital platforms, like on Google or Kindle or whatever. So that's what I missed. It was not the land. It was not the space that was occupied by New York City, but it was bookstores. And I would look forward to my regular trips back to New York to go back to those bookstores. But I am not indigenous. In fact, I know very few people, and have known throughout my life very few people who were indigenous. So, indigenous people in my life have been rare, and I regret that. I really do. I wish that I would have known more indigenous people, but as a college professor, with what I did, living in university and college areas, you are not likely to meet that many indigenous people. Now, I have met some. I have been on some tribal reservations in various parts of the US. So I have interacted with some people who are indigenous, but not that many. And some of my experiences on those reservations were rather sad because I saw the horrendous poverty which existed not on all, but on many of those reservations. And that's a memory that will stay with me for the rest of my life. I sometimes think of it literally as I am going to sleep. I recall this one place I went to where people were so poor, they literally had no food to eat in their home at the time when I was visiting it. That's how poor they were. So there are people like that, sadly, and many of them are indigenous who live under those circumstances. So I love indigenous people, but I'm not an indigenous person because, again, my ties to the land are basically non-existent. I could really care less where I live. The only reason I moved here to the Rio Grande Valley of Texas is for its climate. That's it. Apart from that, I could care less. I feel literally no attachment to this place. And I feel no attachment to any place, to be honest. I wish I did. I wish I did, but I'm being honest, I don't feel any attachment to the land. I do not see the land as my mother, and I do not regard myself as a child of the land, which is, in my view, very sad, because I think I'm missing out on something which is very important. Okay, so basically, what Indigenism is, it is the respect which is shown to indigenous peoples. Doesn't matter where they are, whether you're talking about American Indians or Inuit people or Native Hawaiians or the Aboriginal people of Australia or the Maori people of New Zealand. People like that, in my view, occupy a special place in the world, and they should be treasured, literally treasured and protected. Sadly, in many parts of the world, that protection is not taking place. An example, along the Amazon River, there are many native peoples. Back in the 1970s, there was a movie made about these peoples. The movie was made in a very careful way so as not to disrupt the lives of the people living in those communities. They were fascinating. Some of them spoke with clicks. Many of them wore no clothing. It was like entering into different worlds. They had no televisions, no radios, nothing. Nothing that could be considered as being a part of modernity. They were entirely cut off from the modern world. And yet they seemed to be very, very happy. Now, if you go there, it is not like that at all anymore. Are those tribes still there? Yes. Although many of them have left and gone to the big cities, but the tribes are still there. But now they are all fully dressed. They have computers and TV sets and all the things that you might associate with being a modern person. Now, whether they like it or not, I have no idea. But to me, it is a loss. Why did that happen to those people? Pure capitalist greed, logging. there was a desire for the wood in the jungles where those Amazonian people lived. And so rather than care for the Amazonian people, they simply went in, tore down much of the jungles, and exposed the people living there to the modern world. And so that was really the end, not only of one culture, but of many cultures that ended based upon capitalism, the desire for money placed ahead of people. So a person who advocates for indigenism, including myself, would oppose that kind of thing and would support the rights of indigenous people throughout the world. Now, let's get into a specific category of indigenism, and that is the notion of the Bund. That is who the Bund are. And I have taken some notes, and so I will be periodically reading from, or at least looking at those notes, which again is why I have my glasses on. In terms of Gaza, and Gaza has been a major focus these days for the Bund movement, which I am a part of. I am a part of the Bund, very much a part of it. I won't get into the specifics. I will just say that I am a part of the Bund, meaning an anti-Zionist movement which respects the rights of Palestinians, which supports the rights of Palestinians. Now, the Bund existed once before and disappeared. So now this new Bund was started primarily by Abraham Weisfeld and a few others. It has some similarities with the old Bund, but not entirely. For example, the old Bund was entirely secular. The new Bund is a mixture of secular and religious people. Now, when I say I am a part of the Bund, I am making a somewhat controversial statement. Here's why. Although I am from an Ashkenazi Jewish family, and if somebody called me an Ashkenazi Jew, I would not object, although I would clarify it to say, yes, I am an Ashkenazi Jew, but when I was 14, I converted to another religion, which is true. I think that would be accurate and honest. So because I converted to another religion, some people may have problems with my calling myself a part of the Bund. Not me, I don't, but I can understand why some people would. The leadership of the Bund does not have a problem with it. So I am accepted as being a part of the Bund. And I love the Bund. I despise Zionism. And I love working with other people of Jewish ancestry who, like me, are anti-Zionists and, like me, are pro-Palestinian. The Palestinians are the indigenous people of that area. The Israelis are not. But we'll get into that in just a bit. The Israelis can only claim, I wrote, to have an indigenous ancestry in the distant past based on sacred history. As any historian knows, sacred history is legend, not history. So, for example, the Tanakh, or Old Testament, and the New Testament are both legendary. Why? Because there is no real historical evidence to support most of its content. Like there's no historical evidence that most or any of the individuals mentioned in the Tanakh, like Moses, for example, ever existed. I once had what I think of as a rather odd conversation with a Christian, I guess fundamentalist or evangelical, whatever. And he said to me that there is more evidence for the resurrection of Christ than there is for the existence of Napoleon. And I turned to him and I said, "You've got to be joking." He said, "No, there is." And I said, "By evidence, what do you mean?" "Well, it's discussed in the Bible." And I said, "Well, problem. The Bible is not history, meaning it is not based on primary historical sources, eyewitness accounts. It's not. And so, because none of either the Tanakh or the New Testament is based on primary historical data, to claim that either of those parts of the Bible are history would be a lie. Obviously, he didn't agree with me, but the conversation basically ended at that point because he realized, I guess, that he was not going to win me over to his side of the argument. And of course, there was no way that he could do that. I mean, I know what history is. I've studied history. My Ph.D. minor was in history. So I know how to define it, and I know what is history and what is sacred history. And the Bible is a collection of texts which can be called sacred history, meaning they're historical documents which are used to support the belief systems of particular religious organizations. That's it. That's what sacred history is. It's nothing more than that. And so, no, the Bible does not contain history. Now, there is one slight exception to what I just said, but it's not really much of an exception, and that is the existence of Jesus. Although it is still reasonable to debate the idea of whether Jesus actually existed, and people on both sides, and I'm talking about academics, not believers, can say, yes, he existed, or no, he did not exist, and both could produce evidence to support their statements. The only evidence, if you want to call it that, is in the writings of Josephus, because Josephus actually wrote about Jesus. But again, it was not an eyewitness account. Josephus, in other words, was not using primary historical sources. Instead, he was using secondary historical sources, meaning information that was told by one person to another person, which I guess you could call hearsay. That's basically what secondary historical data is. It is hearsay. So, no, the Bible is not a historical document. And even if you look at individual books it would appear in many cases, were written by different people, meaning the same book has content from different individuals. People who claim that the 5 books of Moses or the Pentateuch or the Torah, same thing, were actually written by Moses, have a really tough burden. Why? Well, a number of reasons. But the main one is that at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book of the Torah, there is a long description of the death of Moses. Now, you can say, which some people actually have, well, Moses was a prophet, so he was predicting his own death. But if you read the account, it does not read like a prophecy. It reads like a story about something that happened. It's not a prophecy. It's a story. It's an account of what happened when this guy, who may or may not have even existed, when he died. That's what the story is about. It's nothing more than that. So, if we cannot take, especially the Tanakh, as a primary historical source, which we can't because it is not one, then the idea of the existence of an ancient Israel, or in Hebrew, Yisrael, is questionable. Was there ever an ancient Israel? Maybe, maybe not. Now, there is evidence that the land that was occupied by Israel, the larger piece of land called Canaan, there is archaeological evidence that Canaan did in fact exist. But as to the specifics of the existence of Israel, no. And the accounts in the Tanakh about Israel are not supported by history either. There is no history. In fact, you can say for all intents and purposes, history did not exist until about 500 years ago. There really was no history until relatively recent in the past. So the idea that the Jews lived in Israel, you can say it, you can believe it, but there is no real historical evidence to support it. What's more, the idea that the Jews are the chosen people. Okay, let's set aside the issue of the reliability and validity of the Tanakh. The term chosen people is not once used in the Tanakh. It may be used in some other Jewish literature. I don't know. Possibly in parts of the Talmud, maybe, but I've asked people and they couldn't point me to any place. So I maybe they just didn't know themselves, but the people I asked were Jewish scholars and they couldn't point me to places either. So the concept of the chosen people is literally not biblical. A term that is close to that is used in the Tanakh, and that is God's treasured people. But that's not the same as chosen people. Chosen would apply a kind of privilege, a destiny, like you are destined to live in a certain land in the future. Treasured just implies basically that God loves you. Well, presumably, God loves everyone. So I'm not sure how that establishes Jews as especially unique, although I could be wrong. But again, this notion of chosenness which, by the way, is not accepted by most Jews in the Western world. It is Orthodox Jews, traditional Jews, and conservative Jews, or at least some conservative Jews, who accept it. The majority of American Jews are Reform Jews. And there is also a denomination or movement called Reconstructionism or Reconstructing Judaism. They are a much smaller liberal Jewish movement. They argue, no, Jews are not the chosen people. So they've entirely rejected that idea. So in other words, most American Jews, if they are aware of what their movement teaches, assuming they even belong to one, reject the idea of the Jews as chosen people. I know my parents found that idea to be laughable. They didn't accept it. I found it to be disgusting myself. My sister also finds it to be disgusting. Most Jews I know don't accept it. I mean, it's not a popular idea because it's elitist. It establishes Jews as somehow existing on some exalted level above other people. That's not a very nice thing to say. That's not a good way to look at your fellow human beings, to see yourself as superior to them. In academia, the term we use for that is triumphalism, meaning that your own people have triumphed over everyone else. That's not a good way to look at other people. Really, it's not a good way. And I hope if you feel that way, that you will give it a second thought and give it up and begin looking at everyone else as your peers and not as members of your own particular religion as being the superiors of everyone else, because you're not. You can take my word for it. You're not. I'm not. And I'm one of you. And I am not superior to anybody. If anything, I see myself as an inferior ant, literally. I do not regard myself as being elevated at all. I might as well be a cockroach or some other kind of insect. That's how I see myself. And I'm not lying. I literally see myself in that kind of lowly way. So, point is, Canaan was home to many Semitic peoples. Maybe the Hebrews or Israelites were among them, but also maybe not. But taking a statement like that and using it to establish the chosenness of the Jewish people to live in the Holy Land and to do what is happening right now with the Israeli Defense Forces basically attempting to kick the Gazans out of Gaza and into Egypt. And the Gazans, they are the indigenous people of that land. As I am not indigenous to anywhere because I have no connection to any land. The Israelis who live in Israel, they are not indigenous to Israel. They come from Europe, North America, from Australia, New Zealand, whatever. They are not indigenous to Israel. The Palestinians are the ones who are indigenous to that area, which is why I say Palestine from the river to the sea. And so, as someone connected with Bund, I support the right of Palestinians. And I challenge the right or the rights of Israelis to dominate that area. Does that mean I think that they should be kicked out? Well, my own personal view is that people should be allowed to live wherever they want. I don't think that is necessarily a universal idea, however. For example, if you are talking about a tribal area, should I be allowed to live in their tribal area and to disrupt their activities? I would say no. So I think there are exceptions to that. But generally speaking, I would say that it is a good thing that anybody should be able to live anywhere they want. I know here in the US, there is all this, for lack of a better term, paranoia about Mexico and about Mexicans crossing over the border. Some of that is legitimate, but most of it is not. The part that is legitimate is the drug trade by the cartels. That is not a good thing because a large portion of drugs that we get here in the US come directly from Mexico, 2 miles from my south. And I don't want to see that continue. But why is that happening? It's happening because the Mexicans, many of whom regard themselves as indigenous people, are so poor that they literally have had no alternative but to turn to the drug trade as a simple means of survival. Do I approve of that? No. Do I understand it? Of course I understand it. But it also means that although I would like to travel throughout Mexico, just cross over the border, say to Reynosa, which is the closest Mexican city to me, I realize that if I went there, I might have my head chopped off, which is not a very pleasurable thought. So I may go there eventually, but so far I have not. There are parts of Mexico, primarily Nuevo Progreso, which are relatively safe, and that is where I go for now. But it's a tourist town, so it's not a real place where Mexicans live. I want to go to a real place where Mexicans live. That's what I want to see. But sadly, because of the tremendous poverty that exists in that country, what am I going to do? I mean, I can take a bus or take a cab across the Rio Grande River to Reynosa and sit on a bench. There are benches apparently right after you cross over. But what am I going to do? I don't speak Spanish. If I started walking around, I would become noticeable. And there is a reasonable chance I might be caught and killed. I don't mind being killed, but being tortured is something else. I don't really want to be tortured, as I think most people, I don't think most people would like to be tortured. Now, to conclude this podcast, which I think is a very convincing way of concluding this podcast, at least I hope it is. I assume that most of you know that maternally, all of us have a female ancestor who has been nicknamed Eve for logical reasons, from Africa. What that means is that maternally, we can all trace our ancestry back to Africa. Yeah. Does that make me an indigenous African? I mean, that's kind of a stupid question. Obviously, I am not an indigenous African. The fact that my ancestry is in Africa, so what? It does not make me an indigenous African. Similarly, even if, and we can only say if, we accept the tentative proposition that Jews or Hebrews lived in ancient Israel, does that mean that the Jews now who are living in modern Israel have an indigenous right to be there? No. The same thing as me saying, because my ancestry is African, does not mean I have a right to move to anywhere in Africa I want. I mean, if I wanted to go there, I suppose I could. I visited the place, Congo, but I don't have a right to go there, nor do I really have any desire to go there. I have nothing against Africa. It's a beautiful place, but I have no attachment to it. But then again, I have no attachment to any place, which is why I am not indigenous. But for those people who genuinely are indigenous people, they should, in my view, be treated with the greatest amount of love and compassion that is possible. But sadly, throughout the world, we are not doing that at all. And that is a real disaster. It is, I would even say, as a religious person, sinful. It is sinful the way that we are treating the Gazans in Africa. When I say we, I'm including myself, because I am an American. And the war by Israel against Gaza could not be taking place if it were not for if it were not for the United States. The United States is providing all the money, all the arms to Israel. They are allowing Israel to do this. So I think we are as sinful, again, using that religious term, as the Israelis. And I think that we deserve to suffer. I really do. I'm sorry for getting religious on you, and I don't like doing that generally. But I really think that we deserve to suffer. I think Israelis should suffer. I think that Americans should suffer. I do believe in collective punishment. Even though I am not a part of what is happening in Washington or what is happening in Jerusalem, I am still an American. And as an American, I feel as though I deserve a portion of the blame. And I have no right, in my opinion, literally, no right to continue living. Does that mean I'm going to commit suicide? No, I'm not suicidal. I'm not going to take my life. That's not the way I am. But do I think I have a right to live? No. No, I don't think I have a right to live. Whether I live is not my choice. But I feel that any American, any Israeli who is alive should be living on borrowed time. And that is literally how I see the Bund, as a part of Indigism. Respect for the indigenous people of Palestine, and not for the thieves, the robbers that entered into Palestine and stole the land, and are now trying to steal even more land than before. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and a better day tomorrow.